My name is Rachel Morgan, and the moment my brother-in-law laughed at my Navy career, his own uncle slammed his bourbon onto the table and barked, "Apologize right now." Every conversation in the room died instantly. No one moved. You know those moments when a house that's been full of chatter suddenly becomes so quiet you can hear the refrigerator humming? It was exactly like that. Kyle blinked at his uncle. "What?" he asked with a little laugh, like he thought it had to be some kind of joke. Nobody laughed back. I wished someone would. Instead, every face around the dining room table slowly turned toward me. I wanted to disappear, not because Kyle had embarrassed me. He'd been doing that for years. I wanted to disappear because Daniel Brooks had recognized something I'd spent most of my adult life trying not to advertise. He still hadn't taken his eyes off Kyle. I said apologize. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. The kind of authority that comes from 35 years in the Navy doesn't need volume. Kyle leaned back in his chair. "For what?" She answered my question. Daniel looked at me. "Commander, would you like to handle this?" I forced a smile. "No, sir, old habits, even after all these years?" He nodded once and sat back down, but the room never recovered. Dinner continued with forced conversation that felt like everyone was reading from different scripts. I picked at the roasted chicken on my plate, while Ethan gently squeezed my knee under the table. "You okay?" he whispered. "I will be." I wasn't lying. I just knew tonight wasn't over. 3 hours earlier, the evening had started like every other family gathering. Ethan and I left our townhouse in Norfolk just after 1:00. The drive to Richmond usually took about 90 minutes unless traffic backed up around Williamsburg. We stopped at Buc-ee's because Ethan insisted nobody made better beef jerky. He also bought a ridiculously oversized soda that barely fit in the cup holder. "You know Kyle's going to say something," he said as we got back on Interstate 64. "I know. You don't have to let him." "I usually don't." He sighed. "My parents should have shut this down years ago. They don't like conflict. They don't like conflict unless it's directed at you." I couldn't argue with that. His family had never quite figured me out. To them, I was polite, quiet, always working, always missing holidays because I was on assignment. They assumed that meant paperwork somewhere. Human resources, logistics, maybe recruiting. I never corrected them. My job required discretion. More importantly, I liked living without people making assumptions. Ironically, they made assumptions anyway. Olivia's engagement dinner was held at Ethan's parents' home in Richmond's West End. The neighborhood was full of brick colonials built in the 90s. Freshly cut grass, American flags, kids riding bicycles, even though the July heat made everyone sweat before they reached the mailbox. Inside, Linda, my mother-in-law, greeted us with a hug. "Rachel, you made it. Wouldn't miss it." She meant that. Linda was kind. Her biggest flaw was that she believed keeping the peace meant never correcting her oldest son. Kyle was already standing in the kitchen, holding a local IPA and telling a story that somehow involved closing another luxury SUV sale. He noticed us. "Look who finally showed up." Ethan rolled his eyes. "We're 5 minutes early. Military punctuality, huh?" Kyle grinned. "Guess that's all that government training." I smiled politely. "It's nice to see you, too." He laughed like we'd shared a joke. That's how it always worked. He'd throw a little jab. If I ignored it, he'd act like we were having fun. If I answered back, I suddenly became the difficult one. After nearly 8 years in this family, I'd learned silence usually cost less. Dinner started around 6 a.m. Olivia looked genuinely happy. Her fiancé, Michael, seemed like a good man, easygoing, respectful. His uncle Daniel had flown in from Annapolis for the engagement. I'd never met him before. He introduced himself with a firm handshake. "Daniel Brooks." "Rachel Morgan." His eyes lingered just a second longer than most people did. Not suspicious, observant. Military people notice little things. The faint tan line where a watch usually sits. The way someone automatically scans exits. Posture. Hands. I noticed him noticing. Then we both moved on. Halfway through dinner, Kyle started, "So Rachel, here we go. Still in the Navy?" "Yes." "What is it now, 15 years? 16. "Dang." He took a sip of beer. "They really know how to keep people around." A few people chuckled. Then came another question. "So what exactly do you do these days?" "I work with leadership development." Not technically a lie. Not the whole truth either. Kyle frowned. Sounds boring. It has its moments. He smirked. I always picture Navy people with cool stories. I've got a few. You probably have one of those military nicknames too. I shrugged. Sometimes. What is it? The table quieted. I don't know why, I answered. Maybe because after years of avoiding questions, I got tired. Maybe because I assumed nobody there would recognize it. Mad Dog. I reached for my iced tea. Before it touched my lips, I heard glass hit wood. Daniel had frozen, his bourbon sat untouched. He stared directly at me, not surprised. Recognizing, then his eyes shifted toward Kyle. Apologize. Kyle laughed. For asking a question? Daniel's expression didn't change. You have no idea who you're speaking to. Kyle actually smiled wider. Oh, come on, Uncle Dan. No. Daniel's voice stayed calm. You apologize because respect should come before curiosity. The room went silent. Michael looked confused. Olivia stared between them. Linda stopped serving mashed potatoes. Even Ethan looked surprised. I wanted to stop it. Really, I did. Master Chief, I said quietly, it's okay. He looked at me. No, Commander. His tone softened. It isn't. Kyle finally realized nobody else was smiling. What is everybody's problem? Daniel folded his napkin with deliberate care. The problem, he said, is that you just mocked someone whose service has earned more respect than you'll probably ever understand. Nobody spoke. Kyle looked at me, then back at Daniel. His confidence slipped just enough for me to notice. What are you talking about? Daniel simply picked up his glass again. Dee, you'll find out when she's ready. He took a slow sip, and for the first time in all the years I'd known my brother-in-law, Kyle had absolutely nothing to say. The drive back to Norfolk that night was quieter than any trip Ethan and I had taken in years. The only sound inside the SUV was the soft hum of the tires on Interstate 64, and the occasional weather report coming from the radio before Ethan turned the volume down. Neither of us knew where to begin. About 20 minutes outside Richmond, he finally spoke. I've never seen Uncle Daniel like that. I kept my eyes on the dark highway. Neither have I. He called you Commander. That's my rank. He glanced at me. I know that's your rank. What I don't know is why a retired Master Chief looked like he'd just seen a ghost. I smiled faintly. He didn't see a ghost. Then what? A memory. Ethan rested one hand on the steering wheel. You don't have to tell me if you can't. I know. That was one of the reasons I'd married him. He could be curious without making curiosity feel like a demand. After another mile or two, I reached over and squeezed his arm. I'm sorry. For what? For putting you in the middle of all this. You didn't. My job did. He shook his head. No. He looked over at me. Kyle did. Monday morning arrived like every other Monday. At 6 Kleist, I was already running along the Elizabeth River Trail. Humidity wrapped around Norfolk like a damp blanket. A retired couple walked their Labrador. 2 sailors in Navy PT gear jogged past me. The smell of salt water drifted in from the harbor. Routine had always helped me think. Every difficult deployment, every loss, every impossible decision. Running cleared the noise, but Kyle kept finding his way back into my thoughts. Not because he'd embarrassed me. I'd learned years ago not to measure myself by someone else's opinion. What bothered me was Daniel. He had recognized my nickname immediately. There were fewer people than most would imagine who even knew it. Most of the sailors I'd served with simply called me Rachel. Mad Dog belonged to a different chapter of my life, one I rarely revisited. By 8:80, I was inside my office on Naval Station Norfolk. The building wasn't impressive. Gray walls, government furniture, coffee that tasted like it had been brewed sometime during the previous administration. Exactly the kind of place where people assumed nothing important happened. I liked it that way. Lieutenant Melissa Carter knocked lightly on my door. Morning, ma'am. Morning. She carried a stack of leadership evaluations. Captain Reynolds moved tomorrow's mentoring session to this afternoon. Thanks. She hesitated. You okay? I looked up. What makes you ask? You've reorganized the same folder 3 times. I laughed. I guess I'm easier to read than I thought. Only if someone works for you. She smiled. Family. She nodded knowingly. I'll pretend I didn't ask. Just before lunch, my phone buzzed. It was the Morgan family group chat. Kyle had posted a meme. A cartoon dog wearing navy camouflage. Underneath it, he'd written, "Watch out, everybody. Mad Dog is coming." Laughing emojis followed. His wife added one. A couple of cousins clicked the thumbs up button. Then came another message. Guess Hollywood's making Top Gun 3. Rachel's probably the star. More laughing emojis. I stared at the screen. Melissa walked into my office. You look like you're deciding whether to throw your phone into the Chesapeake. Tempting. She glanced down. I shouldn't. You shouldn't. I locked the screen without replying. Some arguments aren't worth winning. That evening, Ethan found me watering the tomato plants behind our townhouse. He held up his own phone. I saw the group chat. I figured, I'm calling him. No. He crossed the line. He crossed it years ago, so why let him keep doing it? I turned off the hose, because every time someone argues with Kyle, he somehow becomes the victim. That doesn't make it right. I know. He sighed. I hate that you feel like you have to tolerate it. I don't tolerate it. I looked at the little green tomatoes beginning to grow. I simply choose where to spend my energy. 3 days later, an unfamiliar Maryland number appeared on my phone. I answered. Rachel, Commander Morgan? I'd recognize Daniel's voice anywhere. Good afternoon, Master Chief. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. There was a pause. I owe you an apology. I frowned. For what? I put you in an uncomfortable position. You were defending me. I also exposed something you've clearly tried to keep private. I leaned back in my chair. You couldn't have known, I suspected. How? He chuckled softly. Nobody forgets that nickname. I closed my eyes for a second. I was hoping they had. They haven't. Daniel invited me to lunch the following Saturday at a small seafood restaurant overlooking the Severn River in Annapolis. He arrived wearing jeans, a polo shirt, and an old navy ball cap faded almost white from the sun. He looked less intimidating than he had at dinner. Still sharp, still observant. We ordered crab cakes. After the waitress walked away, he folded his hands. I served with men who served under you. I laughed. Now you're making me sound ancient. You know what I mean? I do. He smiled. They all told the same story. That's dangerous. They said if things went wrong, he stopped. They wanted Mad Dog making the decisions. I looked out across the water. They remembered the good parts. They also remembered the hard parts. I didn't answer. Daniel lowered his voice. I know about Lieutenant Harris. My stomach tightened. Even after 6 years, hearing that name still hurt. It wasn't your fault. I signed the operation order. You also saved 14 others. I couldn't save 15. Daniel didn't argue. Instead, he let the silence sit between us. Sometimes that's kinder than trying to fix someone else's grief. On the drive home, memories I usually kept locked away returned without permission. The nickname hadn't come from being fearless. It hadn't come from being aggressive. It certainly hadn't come from enjoying combat. It started after one miserable night in the North Arabian Gulf. A boarding operation had gone sideways. Visibility was terrible. Communications failed. Several sailors were trapped. Command wanted everyone pulled back. I went anyway. Twice. One of the younger sailors later joked that I was too stubborn to know when to quit. Another called me Mad Dog. The name spread faster than I could stop it. People remembered the rescue. I remembered the one person we couldn't bring home. Nicknames have a strange way of preserving only part of the truth. The following Sunday afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Another family message. This time from Linda. Everyone's coming over next month for Labor Day. Hope you two can make it. Before I could respond, Kyle added one more comment. Maybe Mad Dog can tell us some more stories. For the first time all week, I almost answered. Almost. Instead, I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter. Outside, Ethan was washing his old pickup truck. The sun was beginning to set over the neighborhood. Life felt peaceful, and I had a feeling it wasn't going to stay that way for much longer. Labor Day weekend arrived with the kind of late summer heat that seems determined to remind Virginians that fall is still just a promise. By Friday afternoon, Naval Station Norfolk had started emptying out. Sailors headed home for long weekends. Traffic crawled through the gates. Families loaded coolers into pickup trucks. Kids waving little American flags left over from a neighborhood parade. I had every intention of spending the weekend doing absolutely nothing. Mow the lawn. Change the oil in Ethan's truck. Maybe grill burgers Sunday evening. Normal sounded wonderful. Instead, my phone rang just after 3. The caller ID read Daniel Brooks. Rachel, Commander? I told you to call me Daniel. I've been in the Navy too long. He laughed. Fair enough. Then his tone changed. I need to ask you something. I'm listening. I'd like you to attend next Friday's leadership recognition ceremony at Norfolk. I frowned. I'm already scheduled to be there. I know. You don't usually call people about events they're already attending. No. There was a pause. I'd like your family there. I immediately understood where this was going. No, you didn't even let me finish. I don't need to. They should know who you are. They already do. No, he said gently. They know who they imagine you are. That evening, I told Ethan while we were making dinner. He was slicing bell peppers for fajitas, so Uncle Daniel invited everybody, apparently. What did you say? I said no, he nodded. I figured I stirred onions in the skillet. I don't want this becoming some kind of lesson for Kyle. What if it's bigger than Kyle? It isn't, it might be. I looked at him. For 16 years you've hidden every accomplishment because you didn't want attention. I don't like attention, I know. He leaned against the counter. But there's a difference between being humble and allowing people to rewrite who you are. His words stayed with me long after dinner. Saturday morning, Daniel drove down from Annapolis. Instead of calling first, he simply knocked on our front door carrying a white bakery box. Peace offering, he said. Inside were fresh cinnamon rolls. You came all the way from Maryland with pastries? I know my audience. Ethan laughed and invited him in. An hour later, the three of us sat on the back patio while cicadas buzzed from the trees. Daniel finally explained, the ceremony isn't about medals, I know. It's about leadership, I know that too. They're recognizing officers who've shaped the next generation. I sighed. Daniel, he held up one hand. Hear me out. When I retired, I thought promotions made leaders. He smiled. I was wrong. What changed your mind? I met sailors who served under you. I looked down at my coffee. They all said the same thing. They're too generous. They said you remembered birthdays. I blinked. They said you learned the names of spouses and children. They're exaggerating. They said after Hurricane Florence, you spent your own leave helping junior sailors rebuild flooded homes. I hadn't thought about that week in years. It didn't seem remarkable. People needed help. We helped, Daniel continued. They also said something else. I waited. They trusted you. He didn't rush the silence. In the Navy, he said quietly, that's a bigger compliment than bravery. I still refused, at least until Tuesday. That afternoon, Captain Reynolds stopped by my office. He closed the door behind him. Commander. Sir, I've got a favor to ask. Depends on the favor. He smiled. I hear you're trying to skip Friday's recognition. I wouldn't call it skipping. I would. I laughed. Who told you? Let's just say retired Master Chiefs have an alarming number of friends. I rubbed my forehead. So everybody's involved now. Looks that way. He became serious. Rachel. Sir, how many mentoring sessions have you led? I don't know. Hundreds. Probably. How many officers have you recommended for command? I've never counted. And how many stayed late helping sailors whose marriages were falling apart or whose kids were sick? I shrugged. That's part of the job. No. He looked directly at me. That's part of your character. He stood. You've spent your career making sure other people received credit. He reached the door before turning around. Friday is the Navy returning the favor. Meanwhile, Kyle had no idea any of this was happening. He was still busy being Kyle. Wednesday evening, he posted pictures on social media from a luxury dealership event in Short Pump. Designer suit, sports car, caption, success looks good. My phone buzzed a few minutes later. Another family message. Kyle again. Who's coming to Mom's after the ceremony Friday? Then another. Rachel, maybe wear your dress uniform. It'll make for good pictures. A laughing emoji followed. Before I could decide whether to ignore it, Daniel answered. She always represents the Navy well. You should worry about representing yourself. The group chat went silent. Not one person replied. For once, Kyle didn't either. Friday morning dawned clear and bright. By 7:30, I was buttoning my service dress uniform. The mirror reflected someone I recognized professionally, but rarely saw at home. Rows of ribbons, command insignia, years condensed into pieces of colored fabric and polished metal. Ethan adjusted my collar. Guy, you look incredible. God, I look uncomfortable. Guy, he smiled. Also true. The drive to Naval Station Norfolk felt strangely familiar and strangely different. I'd driven through these gates thousands of times. Today, however, 2 additional vehicles followed us. Kyle and his wife. Gad, Linda and Frank. Gad Olivia and Michael. Gad Daniel rode with them. When everyone gathered outside the auditorium, Kyle whistled. Gad, I've never actually seen you dressed like this. I smiled politely. Most people haven't. He looked around at the officers walking across the courtyard. Pretty big event. It usually is. He leaned closer. So, what happens? Mostly speeches. He laughed. Gah, sounds exciting, gah. It usually isn't. Inside the auditorium, nearly 400 sailors, officers, and family members filled the seats. Flags stood behind the stage. A Navy band quietly played patriotic music, while people found their places. Niga. Kyle whispered loudly enough for several nearby guests to hear. I bet Rachel's hoping nobody asks her to speak. I pretended not to hear. The ceremony began precisely at 9. The commanding admiral entered. Everyone stood. After the national anthem, the admiral walked across the front row, greeting distinguished guests. Halfway across the room, he suddenly changed direction. Instead of continuing toward the stage, he walked directly toward me. He smiled broadly, extended his hand. Commander Morgan. I stood. Good morning, Admiral. God, it's good to see you again. The honor is mine, sir. Around us, conversation stopped. Kyle's smile disappeared. The Admiral continued chatting casually for nearly a minute before moving on. Then another captain stopped. Then a command master chief. Then 2 commanders. Each greeted me by name. Each thanked me for something. Each moved on. By the time the ceremony officially began, my brother-in-law wasn't whispering anymore. He was simply staring at me, looking as though he'd just realized he had spent years laughing at someone he had never truly bothered to know. If you'd asked me afterward what the Admiral said during the first 10 minutes of the ceremony, I couldn't have told you. I was too aware of Kyle sitting 3 seats to my left. Not because I wanted to see his reaction, because I didn't. I kept my eyes on the stage, my hands folded neatly in my lap, trying to disappear into a room where disappearing was no longer an option. The ceremony moved through several awards first. A chief petty officer recognized for community service, a commander retiring after 30 years, a civilian employee honored for mentoring military families. But each applause felt genuine. This wasn't the kind of event people attended for excitement. It was about recognizing years of quiet work that rarely made headlines. I preferred it that way. When the Master of Ceremonies announced the final recognition, I felt my stomach tighten. Ladies and gentlemen, before we conclude today's program, Admiral Hastings has requested the opportunity to recognize an officer whose influence reaches far beyond any single command. I looked down. Daniel had warned me there might be a surprise. He hadn't mentioned this. The Admiral stepped back to the podium. Some leaders are remembered because of the positions they hold. He paused. Others are remembered because they change people. The large screen behind him lit up with photographs. None of them were dramatic. No helicopters, no classified missions, no action shots, just ordinary moments. Me sitting with a young sailor outside the chapel, helping a family unload furniture after a transfer, laughing with a group of ensigns during a leadership workshop, standing ankle-deep in floodwater, handing out bottled water after Hurricane Florence. I hadn't known anyone had taken those pictures. The Admiral smiled. Commander Rachel Morgan has spent 16 years reminding us that leadership is measured one person at a time. My name echoed through the auditorium. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then someone stood, a chief in the back. Another followed, then another. Within seconds, nearly every sailor in uniform was on their feet. The applause rolled across the room until it sounded almost like ocean surf. I stayed seated for one stunned moment before realizing everyone was looking at me. Slowly, I stood. The ovation continued. I wished it wouldn't. After receiving the plaque, I walked to the microphone. Prepared speeches had never been my strength. I looked across the audience. My eyes landed on Ethan first. He smiled with tears already forming. Then Linda. She looked confused and proud. Frank kept blinking, as though he were trying to reconcile the daughter-in-law. He thought he knew with the woman standing on stage. Finally, I saw Kyle. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the floor. I cleared my throat. I don't really know what to say. A few people laughed softly. The truth is, none of us gets here alone. I glanced toward the sailors seated together near the front. Every lesson I've ever taught was first taught to me by someone else. Another pause. And every mistake I've ever made reminded me that rank doesn't make you important. It makes you responsible. The room became still. I've been lucky enough to serve beside extraordinary people. I accept this recognition on behalf of all of them. I smiled. And if any of them are watching today, please stop pictures when I'm not looking. Laughter filled the auditorium. Even I laughed. The tension disappeared. Exactly what I'd hoped. Outside the auditorium afterward, families gathered beneath the shade of old oak trees. Children climbed on retired aircraft displayed near the entrance. People took photographs. Congratulations came from every direction. Several former sailors introduced me to their spouses. One young lieutenant hugged me so tightly I nearly dropped the plaque. "You changed my career, ma'am." "I didn't." "You did." He smiled. "You convinced me not to resign after my divorce." I remembered. Barely. We'd talked for maybe 45 minutes one rainy afternoon. To me, it had been one conversation. To him, apparently, it had changed everything. Moments like that humbled me far more than any ceremony ever could. Kyle approached about 15 minutes later. He came alone. No audience, no dramatic scene. His hands stayed buried in his pockets. "I owe you an apology." I nodded. "You do." He swallowed. "I've been a jerk." "You have." I thought he stopped. "No." He shook his head. I never actually thought that answer surprised me. It also sounded honest. He looked toward the parking lot before speaking again. "I always figured you kept your job vague because it wasn't important." "I know. I judged you because you didn't talk about promotions or money or titles." "I know. I was wrong." I studied his face. For the first time since I'd met him 8 years earlier, his confidence wasn't gone. His arrogance was. There was a difference. "I accept your apology." Relief flashed across his face. Then I added quietly, "But acceptance doesn't erase history." His shoulders dropped. "I understand. I hope you do." I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. About a month later, Kyle called unexpectedly. Not a text, not a group message. An actual phone call. "I need a favor." I smiled to myself. There it was, my son. "What about Tyler? He's talking about joining the Navy after high school." "Okay. He wants to apply for one of the officer programs." I waited. I was wondering, another pause, if you'd write a recommendation. I leaned back in my chair. Writing recommendations wasn't unusual. Writing one for a family member felt different. "When's the deadline?" 3 weeks. "Has Tyler asked me himself?" Silence. "No?" "Then the answer is no." Kyle sounded surprised. Why? Because this isn't your application. It's his." "I know. If Tyler wants my recommendation, he can call me." Another pause, "And before I recommend anyone, I need to know who they are." 2 evenings later, my phone rang again. This time it was Tyler. His voice cracked with nervousness. "Aunt Rachel, hi Tyler, I'm sorry to bother you. You're not bothering me. Dad said I should ask you myself." "I was hoping you would." We talked for almost an hour, not about grades, not about athletics, not about leadership positions. We talked about responsibility, long deployments, missing birthdays, making decisions when every option hurt someone. At the end, he asked quietly, "Do you think I'd be good enough?" I smiled. "I think you're asking the right questions." That mattered more than any resume ever could. A week later, Daniel stopped by our house again. This time, he brought no pastries, only a grin. "I heard about Tyler. News travels fast." "It does." He looked at me. "You know why you refused, Kyle. I wanted Tyler to earn it." Daniel nodded. "Exactly." He smiled. "That's why I recognized you the night of that dinner." I frowned. "It wasn't because of your nickname." "It wasn't?" "No." "What was it then?" He chuckled. "It was the way you stayed respectful after someone tried to embarrass you." He looked toward the Chesapeake Bay shimmering beyond the marina. Anybody can win an argument. Very few people win without losing themselves. For the first time since that awkward family dinner, I realized the real lesson had never been for Kyle. It had been for me. Winter arrived gently that year, not with deep snow or icy roads, but with crisp mornings, bare oak trees, and the smell of fireplaces drifting through neighborhoods across southeastern Virginia. Life settled into something that finally felt ordinary again, which was exactly what I wanted. Every weekday still started the same way. My alarm went off at 5:15, coffee brewed, while I fed our golden retriever Murphy. I'd lace up my running shoes and head toward the Elizabeth River before sunrise. Some mornings I'd pass the same retired Navy veteran walking his beagle. We never exchanged more than a wave. Sometimes that's enough. By 7:30, I was usually at my desk answering emails before the day's meetings began. Nothing about my routine suggested anything remarkable. I preferred it that way. Recognition fades, character shouldn't. The biggest surprise came from someone I never expected to change, Kyle. Not overnight. Real people don't transform because of one embarrassing afternoon. At first, the changes were almost invisible. He interrupted people less. He asked questions instead of making assumptions. During Thanksgiving dinner, when a cousin joked that one of the younger relatives would never survive military life, Kyle quietly replied, "You don't know what people are capable of." The room went silent for a second. Then the conversation moved on. I noticed. So did Ethan. On the drive home, he smiled. "I think my brother's growing up," I laughed. At 42, everybody has their own timetable. A few weeks later, Tyler drove to Norfolk by himself. He had just turned 18. He parked his old Honda Civic outside our townhouse and looked nervous enough to forget where he left his keys. Ethan opened the front door. "You made it." "Yes, sir. You don't have to call me sir." Tyler smiled awkwardly. "I've been practicing." We all laughed. The ice broke immediately. He spent the afternoon with me walking around the waterfront near Nauticus. He had a notebook full of questions, not about medals, not about secret missions, about leadership, about failure, about responsibility. "What was the hardest day you ever had?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately. Finally, I said, "The day I had to tell a sailor's parents their son wasn't coming home." He swallowed hard. "I don't know if I could do that. I hope you never have to." We kept walking. A tugboat moved slowly across the harbor. Gulls circled overhead. "I always thought the military was about being fearless," he admitted. I smiled. "Fearless people are dangerous." He looked confused. "The people you want beside you are the ones who feel fear and still make the right decision." He wrote that down, then closed the notebook. "I don't think Dad ever told me that. Your dad and I have lived very different lives." He nodded thoughtfully. "I think he's trying, so do I." Just before Christmas, Tyler called again. "I got accepted into the scholarship interview." "Congratulations. I couldn't have done it without your recommendation." "You earned that recommendation." "No." He laughed. "I earned the chance to ask for it." That made me smile. He understood. On New Year's Day, Ethan and I drove to Richmond for another family dinner. A year earlier, I probably would have invented an excuse to stay home. This time, I actually looked forward to it. Linda greeted us with her usual hug. Frank immediately asked Ethan for help fixing the backyard fence. Olivia and Michael had brought homemade pecan pie. Everything felt lighter. Kyle met me at the front door before anyone else. "I've got something for you." He handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was an old black and white photograph. A young sailor stood beside an aircraft carrier sometime during the early 1970s. "Who's this?" I asked. "My dad." I looked closer. "I've never seen this picture. There aren't many." Kyle smiled. "I found it while cleaning out the attic." He rubbed the back of his neck. I realized something. "What?" "I spent years talking about success." He glanced toward the photograph. "My father almost never talked about his." I looked at him. "Maybe that's where real confidence comes from." He nodded. "I think so. No speeches, no dramatic apology, just two people standing in a hallway finally understanding each other. Sometimes that's enough." After dinner, Daniel called through video chat from Annapolis. He couldn't travel because his wife had come down with the flu. Everyone gathered around the dining room table to say hello. When he saw me, he grinned. "Commander." "Master Chief," Kyle laughed. "You two are never going to stop doing that, are you?" Daniel shook his head. "Absolutely not." Then he looked at Tyler. "You still planning on joining us?" "Yes, sir." Daniel smiled proudly. "Good." He looked back at me. "I imagine you'll be keeping an eye on him." "I imagine I will." Tyler groaned. "Oh, great." The whole family laughed. It was probably the first time military service had become a source of connection instead of misunderstanding. A few months later, I was back at the waterfront before sunrise. The harbor looked exactly as it always had. Ships came and went. The tide kept moving. People started their day without realizing how many quiet acts of service happened around them. I thought about that dinner months earlier. If someone had told me then that the greatest change wouldn't be in my career but in my family, I wouldn't have believed them. I never wanted revenge in the way people usually imagine it. I didn't want to humiliate Kyle. I didn't want him to feel small. I simply wanted the chance to be seen as the person I really was. Ironically, that only happened after I stopped trying to prove anything. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see before. Respect isn't something you demand. It isn't something you buy, and it certainly isn't something you earn by talking the loudest in the room. Real respect grows slowly. One promise kept, one difficult decision, one act of kindness when nobody is watching. Over time, those quiet moments become a reputation that speaks long before you ever have to. I still answered a mad dog whenever an old shipmate calls. Not because it's a title I'm proud of, because it reminds me of the people who trusted me when things were difficult, and of the responsibility that came with that trust. Those memories matter far more than any nickname ever could. If this story reminded you that dignity often speaks more powerfully than pride, I'd love to hear what you think. Thank you for spending your time with me today. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, family, and earned justice, I hope you'll join me again for the next one. Marriages don't always end with a single explosive fight. Sometimes they end in a very quiet moment when you see the person you love living a life you never knew existed. That's what happened to me in Chicago, though I didn't understand it yet. The morning my daughter suggested we go. When my husband left for a business trip to Chicago, our daughter said, "Let's go surprise Dad." So we booked a flight. But when we arrived at that hotel and the front desk clerk looked up from her screen with a confused frown, something in my chest went cold before I even had words for why. My name is Lily Cooper. I'm 43 years old, and until that weekend, I believed I understood my own life fairly well. I live in a quiet suburb outside Richmond, Virginia, in a brick colonial with a maple tree that turns the whole front yard orange every October. I work as the office manager and bookkeeper at a dental practice, a job I've held for 11 years. One that suits my particular love of order columns that balance appointments that don't overlap, small problems that have clean solutions. My husband Mason is 48. He's a regional sales director for a medical device company, the kind of job that requires a good suit, a firm handshake, and enough charm to make a hospital administrator feel like the most important person in the room. We've been married 18 years. I won't pretend our marriage still burned the way it did when we were 25. Most marriages that last don't. The romance settles into something quieter, shared grocery lists, a hand on my back while we watch the evening news, the particular comfort of knowing exactly how someone takes their coffee. I had always believed that kind of steadiness was worth more than fireworks. I still believe that, actually. I just didn't understand back then that Mason and I had stopped agreeing on what steadiness meant. Over the past 6 months, his travel had increased. Client meetings, regional conferences, FaceTime with hospital procurement teams, reasonable explanations, all of them delivered in his easy, confident way. This particular trip to Chicago, he told me, mattered more than most. A major contract was riding on it. He gave me the hotel name without my asking, mentioned the conference schedule casually over dinner, the kind of detail a man volunteers when he has nothing to hide. When I suggested a video call one evening, he waved it off. The meeting room was crowded. The days were long. He'd rather just talk on the phone when he could. I didn't think twice about it. Why would I? Chloe, our 13-year-old, missed him more than she let on. She's quick and affectionate and fiercely attached to her father in that particular way. Only daughters seem to be. And lately, the house had felt a little emptier with him gone so often. One Saturday morning over pancakes, she looked up from her plate with an expression I recognized instantly. The one she gets when she's already decided something, and is just working up the courage to say it out loud. "Mama," she said, "what if we went to Chicago and surprised Dad?" I laughed at first, but she wasn't laughing, and the longer I looked at her waffle syrup on her chin, eyes bright with the idea, the more I felt something soften in me. Guilt, maybe. We hadn't done much together as a family lately, the three of us. I told myself this trip could fix, that could remind all of us what we were to each other. I requested Friday off work. I booked 2 tickets and a room at the very hotel Mason had named. Chloe spent an hour that evening making a card, her tongue between her teeth in concentration, and when she showed it to me, it read, "We missed you too much to stay home." I called Mason that night to tell him Chloe and I would be busy over the weekend. A small lie meant to keep him from calling while we were in the air. He didn't ask questions. If anything, he sounded relieved in a way I didn't examine, and enough. "Good," he said. "Maybe you two should have a girls' weekend." I remember that sentence exactly, because later I would replay it 100 times, turning it over like a stone looking for the crack I should have seen. That night Chloe couldn't sleep from excitement. She came into our room in her pajamas, hair in a loose braid, and climbed onto the edge of my bed the way she used to when she was small. "Do you think Dad will cry when he sees us?" she asked. "Maybe," I said, smoothing a piece of hair from her forehead, "but in a good way." She smiled and went back to bed, and I lay awake a long while after imagining the look on Mason's face when he opened that hotel door. Surprise, then joy, then that particular warmth he always had for our daughter. I spent the whole night picturing his happiness. I didn't know that when Mason actually saw us standing in Chicago, what would cross his face wouldn't be joy at all. It would be fear. We were up before the sun, the alarm cutting through the dark at 4:30 in the morning. The house still cold with that particular hush that only exists before dawn. Chloe was already awake when I knocked on her door, pulling on the gray hoodie Mason had given her for Christmas, the one with the little embroidered fox on the sleeve. She'd chosen it on purpose. I think some instinct telling her it would mean something to him to see her wearing it. The drive to the airport was quiet rain tapping lightly against the windshield. The highway nearly empty except for the occasional pair of headlights drifting past in the opposite direction. Chloe sat curled against the window with the card in her lap, checking every few minutes to make sure the corners hadn't bent in her backpack. "Do you think it'll get crushed?" she asked, and I told her I'd wrap it in a plastic sleeve at the gate if she wanted, which seemed to satisfy her. Security took longer than expected. We stood in a snaking line under fluorescent light, Chloe worrying aloud about whether her snow boots counted as bulky footwear. And by the time we made it through, we had just enough time to grab coffee and a waffle from a kiosk near our gate. She talked through the whole plan while we ate, how she wanted to knock on the door herself, how I should stand off to the side, so Mason wouldn't see me first, how the two of us would count to 3 and yell, "Surprise!" Together, I watched her animated hands moving through the air as she described it, and I remember thinking clearly and simply that this had been the right decision, that whatever had felt slightly hollow in our house these past months, this weekend would begin to fill it back in. I texted Mason before boarding, "Hope your presentation goes well. We love you." His reply came almost instantly. "Going into meetings. Phone may be off all day." Something about that snagged briefly in my mind. He'd told me the night before that his presentation was scheduled for yesterday afternoon, not today, but I let it go. Conference schedules shift. I've worked in enough offices to know how often the plan changes by the hour. As we taxied toward the runway, another message came through. "Don't wait up tonight. Client dinner." I remember feeling just faintly that he was clearing the day in advance, making sure I wouldn't call and find him unavailable. I told myself I was being paranoid. I put my phone on airplane mode and watched Chloe pull down on the window shade so she wouldn't see how nervous she was about takeoff. Chicago greeted us with a hard, bright, cold wind coming straight off the lake and cutting through my coat like it wasn't there. Chloe pressed her face to the train window as the skyline rose up out of the flat gray horizon, all glass and steel. And for a moment, I let myself feel it too, the excitement of arriving somewhere new, somewhere our family didn't usually go. We took the train into the Loop, then a short walk to the Hotel Mason had named an elegant business tower near the river, with a revolving door and a lobby that smelled like cedar and fresh flowers. We checked into our own room first. Chloe wanted to go straight up to her father's floor, tugging at my sleeve, practically vibrating with anticipation. I sat in, but I told her we needed to confirm his room number at the front desk before we went barging down some hallway. I approached the counter and explained, smiling, that we were hoping to surprise my husband, Mason Cooper, here for the medical sales conference. The young woman at the desk typed for a moment, frowned slightly, and typed again. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm not showing a guest under that name." I told her the reservation was likely under the company name instead, and she checked again more carefully this time, scrolling through what must have been a conference block list. Then she looked up at me, with an expression that was trying gently to be helpful. "Me. The medical sales conference checked out yesterday afternoon." I stood there for a second without saying anything. Mason had told me. The conference ran through Sunday. I remember the strange sensation of the words simply not fitting into what I already knew, like trying to force a puzzle piece into the wrong slot. I told myself there had to be an explanation, an extension, a separate event, something. Chloe was a few feet away in the seating area, still hugging her card to her chest, oblivious, watching the door for her father the way you'd watch for a parade. I called Mason. It went straight to voicemail. I stood at that counter, turning the phone over in my hand, trying to construct some version of events that made sense, when Chloe suddenly stood up and pointed through the tall windows facing the street. "Mom, isn't that Dad?" I turned. Across the street through the gray afternoon light, a man in a familiar brown coat was walking toward the glass doors of a service apartment building. The kind of place executives rent by the month, all clean lines and discreet awnings. I would have known that walk anywhere. 18 years of watching a man cross a room teaches you the shape of him even from a distance, even through glass, even in a city that wasn't ours. But he wasn't walking in alone. A woman had her arm looped through his, laughing at something he'd said, her head tilted toward his shoulder in a way that made my stomach drop before my mind had even caught up to what I was seeing. I moved fast, stepping between Chloe and the window before she could look any longer, murmuring something about how the light was playing tricks, how it probably wasn't him. But I knew. I knew from the coat, the brown wool one I'd bought him 2 winters ago, at the outlet mall in Short Pump, complaining the whole drive home about the price. I knew from the way he carried his shoulders slightly forward, like he was always walking into a meeting he needed to win. I knew from the leather bag swinging at his side, the one I'd given him for his 45th birthday, with his initials stitched into the strap. Chloe wanted to run across the street right then, tugging at my hand, asking why we weren't going to say hello. I told her we should get settled first, drop our bags, let Dad finish whatever he was doing. I needed a few minutes, just a few, to understand what I'd seen before I let it anywhere near my daughter. Back in our room, I called Mason again. This time he answered with a text instead of a call. "Still in meetings. Can't talk." I stared at those words, knowing they'd arrived only minutes after I'd watched him disappear through a set of glass doors with a woman on his arm. There was no more room left for doubt, no gentler interpretation I could bend the facts into. I asked Chloe to stay in the room and watch something on TV while I went down to sort out a mix-up with Dad's reservation. She agreed, a little disappointed, already reaching for the remote, and I stepped out into the hallway, feeling like I was walking through water. I crossed the street and sat in the corner of the apartment building's small cafe, ordering a coffee. I had no intention of drinking, watching the elevator bank and the front doors. 20 minutes passed. Then the doors opened, and Mason walked out with the same woman, both of them dressed for dinner now. Her in a fitted black dress, him in the navy jacket I'd steamed for him myself before he left. This wasn't 2 colleagues finishing a meeting. This was something else entirely. Something with rhythm and habit built into it, the kind of ease that only comes from repetition. He rested his hand at the small of her back as they walked toward the door. She turned and kissed his cheek, light and familiar, and said something I wasn't meant to hear but did anyway, her voice carrying just enough in the quiet lobby. "Once the divorce is final, we won't have to keep doing this." I stood up. My legs moved before my mind had fully processed the sentence. I said his name just that flat and clear. "Mason." He turned, and I watched his face do something I will never forget, the easy, practiced calm sliding off in an instant, replaced by something closer to raw panic. The woman looked between us, confused, her smile fading into uncertainty. "What are you doing in Chicago?" Mason asked, as if I were the one who owed an explanation. Our daughter wanted to surprise her father, I said. His face went the color of the sidewalk. The woman looked at me properly now, taking in my coat, my face, searching for context. Your daughter? She asked. I'm Lily Cooper, I said, Mason's wife. I watched the words land on her like something physical. Her arm slid slowly away from his. She introduced herself. Claire, she said, though I barely registered it at the time, and I could see plainly that she was as blindsided as I was, just from a different direction. Over the next few minutes in halting, disbelieving fragments, the shape of what Mason had built came into focus. Claire believed he and I had been separated for nearly a year. She believed we lived in different houses. She believed the divorce papers were filed and simply awaiting a judge's signature. Mason had even shown her a photograph of the documents. She said the pages spread across a kitchen table she'd assumed was his own. I had never seen those papers. I had certainly never signed anything. Claire's expression shifted from confusion to something colder as the truth settled over her, too. She hadn't just been lied to about a marriage's status. She'd been made complicit in a fiction unknowingly for months. Mason tried to speak something about a complicated misunderstanding, but I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. How long have you been telling people our marriage was over? I asked him. He didn't answer. He didn't have an answer. Or if he did, he wasn't brave enough to say it out loud in that lobby in front of two women who had, each in their own way, trusted him with a version of the truth he'd invented for his own convenience. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. A message from Chloe, 13 years old and still holding a homemade card waiting patiently, 4 floors above a life she had no idea existed. Mom, when can we surprise Dad? I looked at Mason standing there, guilt written plainly across a face I'd known for 2 decades, and understood with sudden and terrible clarity that the hardest part of this day wasn't what I'd just witnessed. It was walking back across that street and figuring out what to say to the little girl who still believed her father was going to cry happy tears when he saw her. Before I went back to Chloe, I turned to Mason once more. I told him quietly, and without drama, that she hadn't seen anything. Not the woman, not the apartment building, none of it. And that he was not to come to our room until I decided how, or whether to tell her something had gone wrong. He tried to follow me anyway, already talking, already reaching for some explanation he thought might soften what I'd seen. I stopped him at the hotel's revolving door. You had months to explain, I said. You chose to lie instead. He didn't follow me further. Upstairs, Chloe was sitting cross-legged on the bed, the card resting in her lap, half watching a cartoon with the sound low. She looked up when I came in, and I watched her face change the moment she really looked at mine. The way children do. Reading you before you've said a single word. She asked why we weren't going to see Dad's hotel room. I told her his plans had shifted because of work, that he was staying somewhere else nearby. It wasn't a full lie. It also wasn't the truth, and I hated in that moment being the kind of mother who had to choose which one to give her. Did Dad do something bad? She asked, and there was no getting around the directness of that question. The way children cut straight to what adults spend hours dancing around. Your father made choices that hurt our family, I said. I'm still trying to understand them myself. About an hour later, there was a knock. Chloe ran for the door before I could stop her. But she slowed when she saw both our faces, mine carefully composed, Mason's raw and uncertain in a way I'd rarely seen. She still handed him the card. He unfolded it slowly, read the words she'd written in careful looping handwriting. We missed you too much to stay home. And I watched something in him break open. He wasn't performing. For the first time all day, I believed what I saw on his face was real, the beginning of understanding what his choices had actually cost. Chloe asked why he'd told us he was in meetings when he wasn't at the conference at all. Mason fumbled for an answer that never quite arrived. She looked at him with the plain, unblinking honesty only a 13-year-old can manage. You told me lying was what people did when they were afraid of the truth, she said. He had nothing to say to that. Neither did I. Later that evening, after Mason left and Chloe had finally fallen asleep with the television still murmuring, my phone lit up with a message from an unfamiliar number. It was Claire. She'd found my information somewhere. Social media, maybe. or an old business card Mason had left in a drawer, and she said, to tell me everything. I almost didn't respond, but something told me I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. So I let her talk. Over the next hour, in a long, unraveling series of messages, Claire laid out 9 months of a relationship built on a story Mason's had constructed with real care. He'd told her we separated almost a year earlier. He said he'd been staying at the Chicago apartment on business trips ever since, slowly building a life there ahead of an eventual permanent move once the divorce was finalized. She sent screenshots, conversations where he wrote plainly, "Lily already signed. I'm just waiting for the court date." In another, he explained he'd used money from his portion of the assets to cover the deposit on the apartment they'd been living in together, part-time for months. I sat on the edge of the bathroom sink after reading that the door shut so Chloe wouldn't wake, and opened our banking app with hands that weren't quite steady. Our joint savings account looked ordinary enough, but the investment account, the one Mason had always managed, the one I'd trusted him with because numbers weren't my interest and seemed to enjoy them, had been steadily bleeding for 6 months. Small transfers, easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. $4. $800 in February, $7,200 in April, $9,500 more in June. Because he handled the investments, I'd simply never checked. Altogether, nearly $78,000 had quietly disappeared. I sat there a long time with the phone glowing in my hands, doing the kind of math that has nothing to do with numbers, counting up not dollars but months, meetings missed, video calls, all the small excuses I had accepted without question. Because I trusted the man giving them to me. When Mason finally texted asking if we could talk in the morning, I didn't answer right away. I looked instead at Chloe, asleep with one arm flung over the blanket, still wearing the fox hoodie she'd chosen that morning to make her father smile. I thought of the question I would eventually ask him, the one that had already begun forming in the quiet of that bathroom. Was Claire the only thing you were hiding? Somehow, I already knew the answer wasn't going to be simple. Chicago hadn't just exposed an affair. It had cracked open a door, and behind it was something far larger, a life Mason had been building for months, brick by brick, while I stood in our kitchen back in Richmond, believing every word he told me. We changed our flights and flew home the next morning. Mason stayed behind, telling us he needed to sort things out with work. Though I understood by then, he simply didn't have the nerve to sit beside us on that plane. The flight home was nothing like the flight there. Chloe didn't talk. The card sat folded at the bottom of her backpack, and she spent most of the trip looking out the window at the clouds, occasionally asking questions I didn't fully know how to answer, whether her father was going to leave us, whether this was somehow her fault for suggesting the trip in the first place. I told her as steadily as I could manage that whatever happened between her father and me, she would never be abandoned. I meant it. I still do. Once we were home, I didn't cry in front of her, and I didn't fall apart the way some part of me wanted to. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I got organized. I backed up every bank statement I could find. I photographed our tax returns, our mortgage documents, the deed to the house. I changed the passwords on my personal accounts and kept copies of our birth certificates, passports, and insurance records somewhere Mason wouldn't think to look. I didn't drain any joint accounts. I didn't destroy a single thing that belonged to him. I didn't post a word of it online. Some instinct in me understood, even in the rawest hours of that week, that how I handled this would matter. Not just for the divorce, but for the woman I would still have to look at in the mirror afterward. I found a divorce attorney named Rachel Moreno through a coworker who'd gone through her own difficult separation 2 years earlier. Rachel was calm, in a way that felt almost clinical, which I needed badly at the time. She told me not to confront Mason further until we'd secured our financial footing. Money moved during a marriage, she explained, generally still counted as shared property, regardless of whose name was on the account. She recommended a forensic accountant. She told me that if Mason had used our joint funds to support a relationship outside our marriage, that spending could be factored back into how our assets were eventually divided. She also cautioned me gently, but firmly not to block Mason from seeing Chloe unless there was a genuine safety concern. Punishing him through our daughter would only end up costing Chloe more than it cost him. I told Rachel in a moment of raw honesty that some part of me wanted him to lose everything. She looked at me evenly and said something I've carried with me since. Your goal isn't to destroy him. Your goal is to keep him from destroying what remains. The forensic accountant confirmed what I already suspected and then some. Nearly $78,000 had moved out of our investment account into personal accounts Mason controlled alone. Some of it covered rent on the Chicago apartment. Some went toward jewelry, weekend trips, a deposit that would have secured that same apartment as a permanent residence. Worse, several of those trips had been submitted to his company as legitimate business travel and reimbursed. And tucked away in our shared cloud storage, a folder I'd forgotten even existed, one we'd used years earlier for wedding photos, was a draft separation agreement Mason had apparently been quietly assembling. In it, he proposed, I keep the house, but take on the full mortgage myself. He intended to keep the bulk of his retirement account. He planned to relocate to Chicago. Chloe in his draft would see him during select holidays, as though her presence in his life were a line item to be scheduled, rather than a relationship to be protected. Mason came home 3 days later, likely expecting tears or shouting or some version of me begging him to stay. Instead, I had the financial documents laid out on the kitchen table when he walked in. He glanced at them and immediately claimed the money had been a personal bonus, something separate from our shared finances. I reminded him calmly that the funds had gone into our joint account first before he'd quietly redirected them. He accused me of violating his privacy by looking too closely. Privacy is closing the bathroom door, I told him. This was deception. He didn't have a response for that either. A few days later, Rachel formally notified Mason that I had filed for divorce and was requesting a temporary order to protect our remaining shared assets. Mathy, he read the letter standing in our kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd eaten 1,000 ordinary dinners over 18 years, and looked at me with an expression somewhere between disbelief and grief. You're really going to end 18 years over one mistake? He asked. I thought about Chicago, the hotel lobby, the apartment building. Claire's arm looped through his, the draft agreement hidden in a folder meant for wedding memories. I thought about every small excuse I had accepted without question, because I trusted the man giving them to me. Chicago wasn't one mistake, I said. It was where I finally saw all the choices you had already made. I watched something in his face give way. Not quite acceptance, not yet, but the first crack in the story he'd been telling himself. Outside the porch, light flickered on with the dusk timer, the same one Mason had installed years ago. Back when installing things for our house still felt like an act of love rather than a habit left over from one. Mason moved into a rented apartment across town, one of those beige complexes with a pool no one used in winter. For the first few weeks, Chloe refused to see him. I never pushed her toward forgiveness, but I did encourage her to talk to someone. A family therapist Rachel recommended, a woman named Dr. Patel, who specialized in adolescents navigating divorce. Mason texted Chloe every day. She read the messages. She didn't answer most of them. I had my own life to keep upright in the meantime. There were bills that didn't care about heartbreak, a job that still needed me at 8 sharp every morning, a daughter whose school schedule didn't pause for any of this. Neighbors asked carefully where Mason had been. Lately, I kept my answers short and unremarkable. I wasn't interested in turning our street into an audience. Claire, for her part, sent everything she had to Rachel, months of text messages, apartment receipts, photographs, even the doctored image of divorce papers Mason had shown her to prove our marriage was already over. She cut off all contact with him completely. When she reached out to apologize to me directly, I didn't feel much anger left for her by that point. You believed the same man I did, I told her. The difference is I believed him for 18 years. Mason's company eventually noticed the pattern in his expense reports. Personal trips to Chicago quietly logged as client visits, hotel charges that didn't match any calendar entry for actual client meetings. There was no dramatic arrest, no handcuffs, nothing from a television drama. He was suspended pending an internal review, required to repay the misused funds, and stripped of his management title. Rather than wait for the investigation to conclude publicly, he resigned. He blamed me at first for destroying his career, as though I'd been the one filing his expense reports for him. I reminded him without raising my voice that I hadn't contacted his company at all. His own paperwork had done that on its own. The divorce settlement negotiations stretched over several difficult months. Matt Mason initially wanted to keep the bulk of his retirement account and have me sell the house outright. But the forensic accounting told a different story than the one he wanted told. Nearly $78,000 diverted toward a life outside our marriage money. The court would ultimately treat as part of his share of our combined assets, rather than an untouched bonus. In the final agreement, I kept the house provided I could refinance the mortgage in my name alone. The retirement accounts were split according to state guidelines. Mason agreed to contribute to Chloe's therapy and future school expenses. Custody was arranged with an emphasis on stability for her, not convenience for either of us. There was no thunderous moment in a courtroom, no judge slamming a gavel, no scene worthy of daytime television. The real weight of everything settled instead in a quiet conversation Mason and I had after the mediation session ended. Standing near the elevators of an unremarkable office building, both of us worn thin from months of paperwork and lawyers and careful guarded phone calls. "I never meant to lose my family," he said. "You didn't lose us in Chicago," I told him. "You spent 9 months building a life that didn't include us." He asked quietly if I thought I'd ever forgive him. I considered the question honestly before answering, because I owed him at least that much honesty even now. "Forgiveness may come later," I said. "Trust is not coming back." He nodded slowly like he'd expected that answer, and hated hearing it confirmed anyway. There was nothing left to say after that. We rode the elevator down together in silence. Two people who had once built an entire life out of small ordinary days, now dividing that life into folders and signatures. Outside, Chloe was waiting in the car exactly where I'd asked her to sit while the meeting finished. She rolled down the window as I approached, her expression somewhere between hopeful and braced for bad news, the way 13-year-olds often look when they're trying very hard to seem older than they are. "Is it over?" she asked. I got in beside her, started the engine, and let the heater begin to hum against the late autumn chill outside. "The marriage is ending," I said. "Our life isn't." She studied me for a moment, the way she'd studied my face back in that Chicago hotel room, searching for the truth underneath my words. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her at least enough for now. She reached over and turned up the radio, and we drove home together through streets that looked exactly the same as they had a year earlier, even though nearly everything about our lives inside them had changed. 9 months passed the way difficult years sometimes do, slowly in the moment, and then looking back all at once. The divorce was finalized in early spring. I refinanced the mortgage on my own, nervous the whole process, but I kept the house, which meant Chloe didn't have to change schools or say goodbye to the maple tree she'd been climbing since she was 6. I picked up freelance bookkeeping work in the evenings, a few small local businesses. At first a flower shop, a family-owned hardware store, word spreading slowly the way it does when people trust you with their numbers. Eventually I turned it into something more official, a small practice of my own. It wasn't the kind of transformation you'd see in a movie, no dramatic reveal of hidden success, just steady, reasonable independence built one client at a time. Chloe and Mason found their way back to each other slowly through short lunches at first, an hour here and there, nothing forced. Their relationship wasn't what it had been before Chicago, and I don't think it ever fully will be. He wasn't handed forgiveness the moment he asked for it. To his credit, he didn't expect it to work that way. He started therapy of his own, and for the first time since I'd known him, he began owning his choices out loud instead of explaining them away. I stayed out of it, mostly stepping in only when I needed to remind him that Chloe's boundaries came first, not his comfort. One evening, months into this new rhythm, Chloe sat on the porch steps beside me while the sky turned that particular shade of orange it gets in late summer. "I still love Dad," she said, watching a pair of fireflies blink somewhere near the hedge. I just don't trust him yet. You're allowed to feel both, I told her, and I meant it more than I think she realized. A few weeks after that conversation, I was cleaning out a hallway closet and found the card the one she'd made for that Chicago trip, still folded the way it had been in her backpack, the crease from the flight permanently pressed into the paper. I brought it to her and asked if she wanted to keep it somewhere. She looked at it for a long moment, turning it over once in her hands. No, she said finally. That was for the dad I thought I was going to see. She didn't tear it up or throw it away in some symbolic act of anger. She placed it carefully in a small keepsake box in her room, tucked between old birthday cards and a ticket stub from a school play. It felt right somehow, not erasing what had happened, just no longer letting it steer the direction of her days. Almost a year after that first trip, Chloe and I flew back to Chicago together, just the two of us this time. We walked along the river, with the wind coming off the water the same way it had before, except this time it didn't feel like something I needed to brace against. We ate deep dish pizza at a place near the Loop, wandered through a museum for most of an afternoon, and took photos in front of the lake, with the skyline stretched out gray and silver behind us. At one point, standing at the railing with the water moving slow beneath us, Chloe asked if I regretted coming here that first time, if some part of me wished we'd never booked those tickets at all. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I regret what we found, I said, but I don't regret finding the truth. She nodded slowly, the way she does when she's turning an idea over in her mind, testing its weight before deciding what to do with it. For a long time after that first trip, I believed it had been the thing that broke our family apart. I understand now that isn't quite right. Chicago didn't create the lie Mason had been living. It simply made it impossible for that lie to stay hidden any longer. The truth hurt more than almost anything I've known, but it also gave me back something I hadn't realized I'd lost along the way. The right to decide clearly and honestly what the rest of my life was going to look like. Our family doesn't resemble what it used to be, but it's still a family, just built differently now, on steadier ground than the one I didn't know I'd been standing on before. Healing, I've learned, isn't about forgetting. It's about reaching a place where the memory no longer decides what tomorrow gets to be. We flew to Chicago because my daughter wanted to surprise her father. Instead, we discovered the life he had been hiding from us. For a long time, I thought that trip ended my family. Now I understand it ended the lie. And sometimes, the end of a lie is where your real life finally begins. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear where it found you tonight. Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. Did Lily make the right choices, or would you have done something differently? We share stories like this every week, so if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and subscribe. Thank you for spending this time with me. Let's keep walking through these stories together.